Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving deep into a collection of electronic music production tips.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's called 101 Inspiring Electronic Music Production Tips.
Hmm?
And we've got some excerpts from it. It's really interesting stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, so whether you're just starting out or you've been producing for years, I think there's going to be something in here for you.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this source is it really gets into the mindset of being a producer.
Yeah.
It's not just like, here's how to use this compressor or that EQ.
Right off the bat, it throws down a pretty bold claim.
Okay.
It says, writer's block doesn't exist.
Hmm.
And I'll admit, there have definitely been times when I've sat down to make music and just felt completely uninspired.
Yeah.
Like I don't know what to do, where to start.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that too.
But are they saying it's all in our heads?
I don't think it's that simple. I
Okay.
think what they're getting at is that we often limit ourselves by waiting for inspiration to strike, Instead of just kind of like sitting around and waiting for this magical idea to appear, it's about being proactive. It's about actively seeking out new sounds, new ideas, new techniques.
So it's almost like reframing how we think about inspiration.
Exactly.
Instead of getting frustrated when we hit a wall,
Right.
we should see it as an opportunity to try something different, to experiment.
Totally. And there's actually a tip in here that speaks to that tip #29. It suggests working backward through your synth presets.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so instead of starting at the beginning and scrolling through, you start at the end and work your way backward. It's a small shift in perspective, but it can really help you break out of your usual patterns and discover sounds you might have otherwise missed.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's like shaking up your routine to spark new ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, speaking of sounds, this source is packed with tips on sound design.
Oh, yeah.
And, tip #2 really dives into the power of layering, which is like essential in electronic music production.
Absolutely. Layering is key.
Yeah. It talks about how you can blend two seemingly different sounds into one using things like sample start points, envelopes, and tuning.
It's really amazing what you can do with layering. It's like taking individual ingredients and creating a whole new dish.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
But it's not just about throwing sounds together randomly.
Oh, definitely not. There's a real art to it.
Yeah.
And tip #37 actually emphasizes that. It says production is reduction. It's about carefully selecting your sounds and then shaping and molding them to fit together perfectly. You're not just adding more and more, you're actually taking away sculpting.
So it's about intentionality.
Yes. Intentionality is key.
It's not about having a ton of sounds. It's about using them in a way that serves the overall track.
Exactly.
Now, I think a lot of aspiring producers might get caught up in thinking they need expensive software or gear to make professional sounding music.
Oh, yeah. I remember when I first started out, I was convinced I needed all the fancy plugins and synths.
But tip #3 actually kind of debunks that myth.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, it says that free software could be just as powerful as paid options if you know how to use it.
That's good to hear. It's reassuring for those just starting out who might not have a big budget.
For sure. But doesn't the specific DAW you use still matter?
Well, that's what's interesting. Tips #11 and #24 both basically say that all DAWs are essentially equal. The most important thing is that you master the one you choose. It's about understanding the workflow, the shortcuts, all the ins and outs of your particular DAW.
So it's more about your knowledge and skill than having the latest and greatest software.
Precisely. And this idea of resourcefulness is a theme you'll see throughout these tips. It's about making the most of what you have, whether that's free software, stock plugins, or even just using creative recording techniques. Like tip #32 even argues that those built-in effects that come with your DAW can often be just as good as expensive third-party options.
That's pretty cool. That's like a challenge to be more creative with what you already have.
Exactly. It's about thinking outside the box and not being limited by your tools.
So we've talked about getting past creative blocks, the power of intentional sound design, and even debunked the gear myth.
Right. It's a lot to think about already.
It is. But what about mixing and mastering? That's where things can get really technical for a lot of producers.
Oh, yeah. Mixing and mastering is a whole other beast.
So what are some of the key takeaways from these tips in terms of getting a good mix and master?
Well, one of the most fundamental tips is #13, which stresses the importance of referencing on multiple systems. You need to hear how your mix translates on different speakers, headphones, even in mono.
Oh yeah, the mono check. I used to overlook that all the time.
Yeah.
But it's so crucial for making sure your mix doesn't completely fall apart when played on a club system or something.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the stereo field and forget about mono compatibility. But these tips also remind us that mixing isn't just about technical perfection. It's also about creativity and experimentation.
Okay, how so?
Well, like tip hashtag 43 suggests using parallel processing for more than just compression. Parallel compression is a pretty common technique, but they're talking about using it with other effects too. Like imagine using parallel distortion or delay on a vocal. It can create some really interesting textures and effects.
Hmm, that sounds cool. But wouldn't that make the mix too muddy? How do you keep things clean while still experimenting with those kinds of effects?
That's where your mixing skills come in. You need to find the right balance and make sure everything sits well in the mix. It's like a puzzle. Each element needs to have its place.
It's a reminder that mixing is as much an art as it is a science.
Totally. And these tips really highlight that balance between the technical and the creative.
Right. So it's not just about having all the technical knowledge, it's about using that knowledge in a way that serves the music.
Exactly.
Now, there are some tips in here that might seem a little counterintuitive at first glance, like tip hashtag 4, which suggests using EQ boosts to find problematic frequencies.
Oh, yeah, that one threw me for a loop at first, too.
Yeah, we usually think of EQ as a way to cut unwanted frequencies, right?
Yeah, to clean things up.
But this technique is about actually boosting those frequencies to identify the problem areas more easily.
Huh. It's like shining a spotlight on the troublemakers so you can take care of them.
Exactly. So you're not just blindly cutting, you're actually listening and making informed decisions.
I like that analogy.
And it goes to show that sometimes the most effective techniques are the ones that challenge our assumptions.
Totally agree.
It's about thinking differently and approaching things from a new perspective.
Yeah, and that can lead to some really interesting results.
Absolutely. Now, another tip that kind of surprised me was hashtag 17, which advocates for committing to audio and starting your mix from scratch.
Oh, wow. So bouncing down those MIDI tracks and working solely with audio, that's pretty bold.
Yeah, I know, right?
I'm curious, what's the advantage of that approach?
Well, they argue that it forces you to make decisions and commit to your sound. By rendering your tracks to audio, you eliminate the temptation to endlessly tweak and refine the original arrangement.
Ah, I see. So it's like saying, okay, this is the foundation now. Let's build the house.
Exactly. It creates a sense of finality and helps you move forward in the mixing process with a clear vision.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about streamlining your workflow and avoiding getting bogged down in the details.
Right. And speaking of workflow, tip hashtag 28 emphasizes the importance of color coding and organizing your DW sessions.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one for me, especially in electronic music production where you're often dealing with a ton of tracks and layers.
Yeah, it can get really messy really fast.
Totally. But a well-organized session makes everything so much easier to manage.
It's like having a clean studio space.
Exactly. A cluttered workspace can lead to a cluttered mind. And when your mind is clear, you're free to be more creative.
I love that. So it's not just about making things look pretty. It's about setting yourself up for success.
Absolutely. It's about creating an environment that supports your creative flow.
And this leads us to another really important takeaway from these tips, and that's the importance of stepping outside of your comfort zone.
Oh, how so?
Well, tip hashtag 39 encourages producers to try a new instrument altogether. Even if you've been producing for years, learning a new instrument can spark fresh creative energy and lead to unexpected musical discoveries.
That's so true. It's easy to get stuck in your routines and rely on the same sounds and techniques.
Yeah, we get comfortable.
But picking up a new instrument forces you to think differently and approach music from a fresh perspective.
It's like opening up a whole new world of possibilities.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the source actually argues that our initial unfamiliarity with a new instrument can lead to some of the most innovative results.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because we're not bound by preconceived notions of how the instrument should be played. It allows for more freedom and experimentation.
I could definitely see that.
It's all about embracing that beginner's mindset where everything is new and exciting.
That's a great point. It's about rekindling that sense of wonder and curiosity.
Yeah, and that can really reinvigorate your creative process.
Absolutely. Now, another tip that caught my eye was hashtag 5. It talked about something they call learning the look.
Learning the look, what's that?
It's about using visual analyzers to study the frequency balance of commercially successful tracks.
Ah, so you're basically looking at the visual representation of the sound.
Exactly. And the idea is that by analyzing well-produced tracks, you start to develop an intuitive sense of how different instruments occupy the frequency range and how they interact with each other.
So you're training your eyes to recognize patterns in the frequency spectrum.
Right. It's like learning to see the sound.
That's a really cool concept.
It is. It's about developing a deeper understanding of how sound works visually. and it can really help you make more informed mixing decisions.
Yeah, I can see how that would be helpful.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from getting past creative blocks to intentional sound design to the importance of organization and experimentation. And these are just a few of the many insights that this collection of tips has to offer.
It's pretty amazing how much valuable information is packed into these 101 tips.
It is. And it really highlights the depth and complexity of electronic music production. But it also shows that it's a journey that anyone can embark on with the right mindset and approach.
I couldn't agree more.
And we're just getting started. We've got plenty more tips to explore, so stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive into the world of electronic music production.
Can't wait. Yeah, it really is amazing how much you can learn from analyzing those visual representations.
It's like a whole other layer of understanding.
Yeah, for sure. Now, remember how we were talking about those counterintuitive mixing tips?
Oh yeah, like the one about using EQ boosts.
Yeah, that one. Well, there's another one that kind of blew my mind. Tip #17. It suggests committing to audio and starting your mix from scratch.
Whoa, wait, so you're saying like bouncing down all those MIDI tracks and just working with audio files?
Exactly. It might seem crazy, but there's a method to the madness.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, the source argues that it helps you make decisions and commit to your sound. By rendering your tracks to audio, you're basically eliminating the temptation to endlessly tweak and refine the original arrangement. You know how it is, you can get stuck in that loop forever.
Oh yeah, I know that feeling all too well.
Right. But by committing to audio, you're creating a sense of finality. It's like saying, okay, this is the foundation, now let's build the house.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. So it's about moving forward in the mixing process with a clear vision.
Exactly. It helps you focus on the big picture instead of getting lost in the minutia.
I like it. It's like streamlining your workflow, making those decisions and then sticking to them.
Right. And that can free up a lot of mental space for creativity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of creativity, there's another tip that really resonated with me. It's tip #39, which encourages producers to try a new instrument altogether.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I've definitely found that learning a new instrument can spark a lot of creative inspiration.
It's like opening up a whole new world of sounds and possibilities.
Totally. And you know what's interesting? The source argues that our initial unfamiliarity with a new instrument can actually lead to some of the most innovative results.
Really? How so?
Well, because we're not bound by preconceived notions of how the instrument should be played, we're more likely to experiment and come up with unique ways of using it.
That makes sense. It's like approaching it with a fresh perspective. No rules, just pure experimentation.
Exactly. It's all about embracing that beginner's mindset.
Now let's talk about those low-end frequencies.
Oh, yeah. The kick and bass. Always a challenge to get them right.
For sure. Tip #47 highlights the classic sidechain compression technique, which is like essential for creating space between the kick and bass.
Sidechaining is definitely a must-know technique. But, you know, tip #92 actually takes it a step further.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it suggests blending different kick samples by isolating their attack, body, and tail. So you're basically creating a hybrid kick that combines the best elements of multiple samples.
Whoa, so you're like Frankensteining a kick drum.
Kind of. It shows the level of detail and control you can have over your sounds when you really understand the anatomy of a sample.
It's like sonic surgery. Pretty cool.
It's all about getting creative and not being afraid to experiment with different techniques.
Now, all of this technical stuff is great, but at the end of the day, it's all about connecting with the listener on an emotional level.
Oh, absolutely. The music has to make you feel something.
And tip #66 really drives that point home. It basically says that listeners don't care about the technical details. They care about the feeling the music evokes.
That's so true. We can get so caught up in the technical aspects of production that we forget about the heart of the music.
It's easy to get lost in the weeds.
But ultimately, it's about touching the listener's soul, not just their ears.
Right. It's about creating something that resonates with them on a deeper level. Something that moves them, makes them think, makes them feel.
And that all comes down to expressing yourself authentically through your music.
Now, one of the things that I really appreciate about these tips is that they acknowledge the importance of the human element in music production.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Even in electronic music, which can be very technical and precise, there's still a need for that human touch.
And tip #99, which focuses on humanizing drums, really speaks to that. It cautions against going overboard with quantization.
Oh, yeah. Quantization can be a great tool, but it's important not to over-quantize. You want to maintain some of that natural groove and feel.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between perfect timing and human expression.
It's like a dance between precision and imperfection.
I like that.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that music is meant to be felt, not just heard.
Absolutely. It's about creating something that grooves, something that makes you want to move.
So we've talked about a lot of different aspects of electronic music production, from the
Mm.
technical to the creative to the human element. And one of the overarching themes that I've noticed, the importance of experimentation.
Oh, yeah. Experimentation is key. That's how you discover new sounds, new techniques, and ultimately your own unique voice as a producer.
It's about pushing your creative boundaries and embracing those happy accidents that can happen along the way.
Sometimes the best discoveries come from making mistakes.
Totally agree. And experimentation doesn't always have to involve drastic changes. Sometimes it's about the subtle tweaks and variations that add that extra bit of magic to your sound.
Like tip #83, which suggests retiming the snare slightly off the grid.
Yeah. It's a small adjustment, but it can make a big difference in how the groove feels.
It's all about those little details that add up to create something special.
And it's a reminder that sometimes the most effective techniques are the simplest ones.
Totally agree. It's not always about having the fanciest gear or the most complex processing. Sometimes it's about using those basic tools in creative ways.
Now, one last tip that I want to touch on is #82. It talks about a technique called Haas panning. Have you ever heard of that?
Haas panning. It rings a bell, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory.
So basically, it involves delaying one channel of a stereo signal by a very short amount, like 10 to 30 milliseconds. And it creates this interesting whitening effect.
Oh, right. It tricks the brain into thinking the sound is wider than it actually is.
Exactly. But the tip cautions against overusing this technique because it can create problems with mono compatibility.
Yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Always got to check that mono.
For sure. So it's a powerful tool, but it needs to be used judiciously.
Like most things in music production, it's all about balance.
Right. Finding that sweet spot between creativity and technicality, experimentation and precision, and most importantly, making music that moves you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I just want to reiterate the importance of embracing the journey. Music production is an ongoing process of learning, experimenting, and refining your craft.
And don't forget to have fun along the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
it really is a journey, isn't it?
It is. And you know what? These tips aren't just about making your music sound better. They're about expanding your creative vision and finding your unique voice as a producer.
Absolutely. It's about developing your own style, your own signature sound.
Exactly. So if you had to distill all of this down to one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
I'd say embrace the process. Don't be afraid to break the rules, and most importantly, have fun along the way.
I love that. Embrace the process, have fun. That's really what it's all about.
It is, because if you're not enjoying the journey, what's the point?
Right. Music production should be a joyful experience, even when it's challenging.
Exactly. The challenges are all part of the fun. They're what help us grow and evolve as producers.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay, I'm listening.
Remember tip #39, which encourages us to try new instruments.
Yeah, step outside your comfort zone.
Well, I want you to consider how that applies to your production process as a whole. How can you step outside of your comfort zone, whether it's through a new instrument, an unfamiliar production technique, or even just a different way of thinking about music?
That's a great question.
It is, because sometimes the greatest discoveries come from venturing into the unknown.
So true. It's all about pushing those boundaries and seeing what happens.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
I've had a blast. Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And to all of our listeners out there, keep those creative sparks flying. We'll catch you next time.